Coffee. Some say it's the ultimate biohack, while others claim it's the root of all chronic inflammation and so it should be completely avoided. So, what's the truth? Well, in this episode, I want to dive into coffee and caffeine and kind of figure out, based on scientific evidence, based on what I've learned about coffee, how bad is coffee really? Or is it something that you can safely enjoy that can actually benefit you more than it harms you? And I'm saying this because if you look around, especially in the biohacking world, everyone has an opinion on coffee, on caffeine in particular, from Peter Attia to Andrew Huberman to carnivore purists like Dr. Anthony Chaffee. They all have an opinion, and some of that is completely contradictory. It's how can two people have such a different opinion on one simple thing, that is coffee? So let's dive into all of this. And, this isn't about, selling you on coffee or against coffee. It's about giving you more information so you can make an informed decision and maybe decide for you if coffee is worth having part of your lifestyle, or maybe not, or maybe a different coffee than what you've been consuming. Welcome to the Primal Shift podcast. So let's talk about the pros of coffee and caffeine first. Number one is caffeine blocks adenosine, and that reduces the perceived fatigue. And I'm saying perceived, remember this, because we'll talk about that more in the con section. But by blocking adenosine, you improve alertness, or it improves alertness, focus, and can even increase physical performance. And, studies have shown that caffeine can boost reaction time, endurance, and strength output. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of athletes use caffeine as a pre-workout supplement. I mean, I typically have, not necessarily because of the workout, it just so happens timing-wise that I consume my coffee and then I go workout. And yes, I can tell I can perform better. Now, there is a limit to this. I remember one event or one incident back in my days as a professional athlete. I took caffeine pills before a competition, 100-meter race, and I consumed so much that I was jittery and I felt nauseous already, close to throwing up, and my performance was shit. So you can certainly overdo it, but up to a certain level, it absolutely improves physical and mental performance. It also is relatively rich in antioxidants. And for many people who follow a Western diet, coffee is the number one source of polyphenols and other antioxidants. So there you have it. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people like coffee, because of this antioxidant properties. There are also epidemiological studies that link moderate coffee consumption, like I'm talking 2 to 4 cups a day or so, to lower risk of type 2 diabetes, Parkinson's, and even all-cause mortality. So there is something to be said about consuming coffee in moderation. On the flip side of that, caffeine raises cortisol, and that can increase anxiety, especially if you're sensitive. It also, the adenosine blocking that I've mentioned before, where it reduces your perceived fatigue. You only think you have energy. A lot of people really think caffeine gives them energy. That's not the case. It doesn't give you energy. It makes your brain believe you're less fatigued than you really are. And so you can perform tasks then that you otherwise probably wouldn't be able to, but that comes at a cost, because that energy that you're borrowing or that you're taking is then missing somewhere else, be it, missing in your immunity, and your immune system is missing it, your stress response. There are a lot of, you pay for that, basically, for that borrowed energy, so to say, or for redirecting that energy that you don't really have. So it's a bad idea to run on chronic sleep deprivation, then just load up on caffeine in the morning and think you're good to go. You are not. You're actually harming yourself by doing that. The other thing is, it does interfere with sleep, again, depending on timing and your individual sensitivity. But even if you think you sleep well, consuming coffee before bedtime or late in the afternoon, it negatively impacts your deep sleep. You might not be able to tell that, based on how quickly you fall asleep or not. You might be able to just fall asleep fine, but you're not going to get into those deep restorative phases of sleep, or at least not as much, if you consume caffeine too close to bedtime. It is just what it is. Again, individual sensitivities vary, but generally speaking, caffeine late in the day impacts your sleep. Not a good thing. And habitual use uh, obviously creates a tolerance. I mean, you can probably tell if you drink coffee for a while, then you are less sensitive to it. You respond less to it. And that's a good thing to a degree, but it also can lead into dependency, where if you don't get your fix, then you have you have negative side effects. And that's also not a good thing. So you really need to be careful with caffeine, to consume it more like, the coffee, or at least not the caffeine itself, for the flavor, for the ritual, for the smell maybe, but not because it gives you energy. It doesn't. And if you start getting like jittery and stuff, if you don't have it, that's a sign that you've had too much and you need to back off a little bit. There are also those, including Dr. Jaffe. He's mentioned it in several podcasts that I've listened to. He's a carnivore guy, fairly strict carnivore guy, and in good shape and everything. And he said that by cutting out coffee, he feels less delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS. So meaning that when you work out and you're sore after, if once he cut out caffeine, he doesn't feel sore, or not as sore anymore, because with the caffeine, he had a lot of inflammation, or enough that make that DOMS worse. And he has better recovery without drinking caffeine. And there could be several mechanisms to that. It could be possibly the reduced cortisol. By cutting out coffee, you get less of a cortisol spike. It could be because, coffee ultimately is a plant. Fewer plant defense chemicals like the polyphenols and alkaloids, those are also defense chemicals. So it could be the reason for that. Honestly, I think that what you get with most coffee, especially conventionally grown, but even organic coffee to a degree, is a lot of toxins that cause a lot of the issues associated with coffee consumption. And I'm not talking about excessive coffee consumption, excessive caffeine intake, but just the DOMS, the inflammation, all of those things. I have yet to notice that with clean coffee, and we'll talk about what that means. Because here is the thing, caffeine and coffee can be a powerful tool, but like any stimulant, it is very much context dependent. And if you rely on it to function, that is a problem, and we'll talk about more of that. But my recommendation is to consume it, again, for the flavor, for the taste, for the ritual. I mean, we talk about this in a little bit, but my wife and I, we both grew up in a coffee culture in countries that have a strong coffee culture. And so we're kind of, there is emotions associated with it. There is family associated with it, much like sharing a meal. There's coffee time in the afternoon, as we had it. I don't do that anymore because now I know that it's not good for me. But still, drinking coffee together, sharing coffee, maybe over breakfast or what have you, is a cultural thing for us. Now, let's get back to the toxins in coffee, and especially those that you get with conventionally grown coffee, because here is the thing: coffee is one of the most contaminated crops on earth, meaning that it's often grown in developing countries with heavy pesticide and fungicide use. And by consuming conventionally grown coffee, you get a lot of pesticides. You get glyphosate, which is a weed killer, gut disruptor, and it's been linked to cancer, so not a good thing. But even organically grown coffee is often contaminated with mycotoxins, and those are toxic mold metabolites. Like ochratoxin A is one of those examples, but there are several that are predominantly found or often found in coffee crops that you get from moldy beans, and that mold might grow on those beans when they are washed and improperly dried, when they are stored improperly. And that's especially true in large manufacturing facilities where that coffee or the beans might be in the warehouse for a while. It might be humid conditions. It might be, all kinds of issues that facilitate mold growth. And once mold grows, then very often you end up with those toxic metabolites called mycotoxins. And they are problematic because they can cause all sorts of health issues. And the problem is, even if you buy organic coffee, that does not mean it's mycotoxin free. And so you really have to look for coffee brands that specifically test for mycotoxins and for mold and for all of the other issues that contaminate coffee crops, unfortunately, very often. And so what I've learned is, as part of our venture into finding clean coffee and ultimately then deciding with my wife that we're going to import coffee from Costa Rica, that a lot of the coffee that's out there, particularly the conventionally grown, so the non-organic coffee, it's just a huge source of toxins. And I would argue that if you drink coffee and you negatively respond, if you drink coffee responsibly and you negatively respond to it, it is very likely, or there's a good chance, that it's not the coffee itself or the caffeine or maybe the inherent plant defense chemicals of the coffee bean, but the stuff that's on it and in it: pesticides, fungicides, glyphosate, which is a herbicide, and mycotoxins, and so those are often the issue. And so when we started realizing that coffee is just of such poor quality across the board, and even the organically labeled ones are not necessarily free of those mycotoxins or microplastics from the pouches. I mean, most of those coffee pouches are also come in pouches or in containers that expose the insides, the beans, to shedding from microplastics. And so all of that is not a good thing. And so we were out for, to look for better alternatives and cleaner alternatives. And one day, my wife and I were in Costa Rica. As I mentioned before, we both come from very strong coffee cultures. I'm Austrian, and coffee in Austria and coffee houses is a big thing. I think the Turks brought it into Vienna, and from there it spread, and we have a very, very strong coffee culture. I remember back in the days, afternoon coffees with the entire family. Even at the time where I didn't drink coffee yet, that was a big thing. And my wife's Costa Rican, so that's where some of the best coffee on this planet comes from. So she grew up in a country where coffee is grown, and living close to coffee plantations and everything. So she has a very strong association with coffee and her entire family. And then one day we discovered that Kathy's mom, my mother-in-law, went to high school, or had her best friend in high school is now growing coffee on a small regenerative organic farm. So no pesticides, no chemicals, period. Grown on organic soil on the slopes of the Turrialba volcano. So very volcanic, nutrient-rich soil. And it's a very small operation. They grow like 1,000 kilos a year or so. So fairly small in process. Everything is hand harvested. It's not washed, but honey processed, so sun-dried and honey processed, and then roasted freshly and shipped immediately without big warehouses in between. So it's a very, very small operation. And it was about 2 years ago we discovered that. And so from that point on, we started bringing that coffee from Costa Rica to the US so we could consume it, and we've been, buying like 50 kilos here and there, and would, put it in the freezer at home so it stays as fresh as possible. And we would be drinking that, and we absolutely loved it because it's so flavorful. It tastes so good. It smells so good. And knowing that it's absolutely clean was, for us, it was like, this is awesome. And so over time, people ask us, hey, where can I buy this coffee? And I'm like, well, unfortunately, you can't, unless you go to Costa Rica and buy it there, because they don't export or anything. They just, local small operation. And we got asked so much that we're like, you know what, maybe we should, import that coffee. And so my wife and I and Kathy's brother, Richie, we decided, what, why don't we import that coffee and make it available to friends and family over here? And then maybe, if someone wants to buy it, so be it. And that was how Terra lava was born. Terra meaning earth, and lava, well, lava because, the coffee is grown on volcanic soil. And I'm like, you know what, before we, do any of this, let's go and test this coffee to make really sure. I trust the farmers. I know them personally, Viviana and her friends, they don't add any chemicals whatsoever, but of course, you always want to be sure. And so we sent this coffee to labs, to independent labs, ISO certified labs. We tested for over 300 pesticides. We tested for mycotoxins, for glyphosate, for mold, for yeast, for bacterial contamination, for all of that. And it came back zero. As clean as you can possibly get. And I'm like, this is the best coffee. Taste and all are a relative argument. Everyone has a different opinion on that. But just from a pure quality perspective, this is the best coffee we've ever had. We can buy, we can find. Let's bring it to the US. And so we decided to do this. And we just recently kind of soft launched terralava.com. Again, it's a very small operation because there are only 1,000 kilos a year per season, per harvesting season that they can farm and ship to us. But we started importing the first batch, the first couple of kilos, and we started selling it. And so far, the feedback from those who have tried it, who have used it, was absolutely phenomenal. Everyone says it's the best coffee they've ever had. And so I want you, not here a cheap sales pitch or anything, but I want you to try it out and let me know what you think. I think it's the best coffee there is, and it has kind of reshaped my opinion on coffee and caffeine a little bit. I mean, we've been, doing it a certain way or consuming caffeine and coffee in a certain way for the last 2 years with this coffee before it was called Terra Lava. But here, my tips based on what has worked for me, it might be different for you, but I would recommend, to limit your intake to 1 to 3 cups, ideally as early as you can in the day. For me, my cutoff is like 10, 11 a.m. because I can tell, not only based on metrics on my sleep trackers or that I get from my sleep trackers, but also by how I feel the next day, in the evening, before falling asleep, that caffeine later in the day negatively impacts my slow wave sleep or my ability to fully recover at night. So my cutoff is 10, 11 a.m. If I have up to 3 cups until then, I'm perfectly fine. I'm not dependent on caffeine or anything. I crave the smell. I crave the taste, but not the caffeine. And I've done this experiment by just removing it for a month and see how I feel. I felt no different. I'm like, okay, I don't feel any better. I don't feel any worse. It's safe for me to consume that. I don't rely on it for energy, and I recommend you don't either. Use it for enjoyment. Use it because you like the taste. If you drink coffee only, as a pumpkin spice double chocolate, what have you, latte, you're not really drinking coffee. But if you truly enjoy the taste, I mean, my first cup is typically black. My second cup is with cream. That's usually what I have when I walk the dog. So that's kind of my first few calories, so to say. I think that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it, But if you do drink coffee, I highly recommend you do it with, or you consume coffee that has been tested and is free of pesticides, glyphosate, fungicides, herbicides, and mycotoxins, most importantly. So even if you have an organic brand that you really like, ask the brand, hey, do you test for mycotoxins? I'd like to see the test reports. I think that's incredibly important because mycotoxins are so prevalent and they can cause severe health issues over time. Those random headaches, those, runny nose or stuffy sinuses, that, achy joints, all of that can go back to mold or mycotoxins that you might be getting from the coffee. You might be getting it from your home. You might be getting it from other places as well because mycotoxins are so prevalent. You might be getting it from the peanuts that you eat, But the coffee is just one of those sources that a lot of people drink coffee. And so I would argue a lot of people are exposed to mycotoxins and don't even know it. So I would recommend make sure those beans that you consume are tested. Obviously we like our brand because I know what it's in there. I know who grows it. I actually go there in a couple of months, well, in very few months, and help pick some of those beans. They're going to end up in that coffee that I consume then at home. I mean, there is nothing, I can't be any closer. We cannot grow coffee here in Georgia, but by knowing the farmer personally, I've met Viviana a couple of times already. It's a close friend of the family. We can go anytime and look at how they process the beans, how they pick them, how they dry them, etc., how they roast them. And I mean, I can pick up my own bag and bring it home and, and brew that coffee. And so that's, as close to the source as I can possibly do it without having to grow it myself. And so I obviously like Terra Lava. This is the brand, by the way. I really like the design as well. I mean, let me know what you think, but this is very much Costa Rica inspired. And again, the pouches are compostable, so no microplastics in there either. And with a medium roast and a dark roast up there. I like the taste, but again, it's my coffee, so obviously I do. I don't think coffee is for everyone, and I don't necessarily think that caffeine can be consumed without limits. I think there is a very fine line between drinking it because you enjoy the taste and drinking it because you need to have caffeine to function. If you've reached that point, by all means, drink something else, drink tea. and take a break, get off that need, that addiction at the end of the day, and pay attention to your sleep. Even if you fall asleep fine, there is still a chance that by consuming coffee too late in the day, you're going to affect your slow wave sleep, and that's going to affect or negatively impact your recovery for the next day. And it's like a vicious circle. So caffeine, be careful, but I think if you do it right, you can absolutely enjoy it and reap a lot of the benefits from caffeine, being, getting in a good mood because you smell that fresh, brewed coffee in the morning. And I go, to the office in the morning and I have my cup of coffee here and I work on emails, and it just makes me feel good. It doesn't give me energy. It makes me feel good. I love the ritual of consuming coffee and then sharing maybe a cup with my wife while we walk the dog later in the day. Absolutely amazing. And so I think it's, coffee and caffeine isn't inherently good or bad. It's how it's grown, processed, and used to determine whether it's medicine or poison, at the end of the day. And so be intentional, choose purity over convenience. If you think that high quality coffee is too expensive, I would argue maybe drink less. And what you drink is the highest quality you can possibly get with the least amount of toxins. That's my opinion. For us, coffee is a connection, it's a ritual, and quality, it's not stimulation. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. Let me know what you think. What coffee do you like? Have you found brands that are clean that you can recommend to anyone? Let us know. I think it's always a great idea to have as many options as possible so you can find exactly the one that you like the best, that you maybe, you like the flavor, or you like the, the brand behind it, whatever the case might be. Let me know. Shoot me an email. Leave me a comment if you're watching this on a platform supporting comments. Until next time.